Hello, everybody. Welcome to the morning show. So happy to have you with us today. We're coming to you on Channel 9. We're also broadcasting on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at www.ncmhub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon. We're also coming to you on our radio station, WJOP-LP Newburyport, FM 96.3. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm so honored and thrilled to have as today's guest, Dr. Claudia Wiedeman. She works with the Showa Foundation at the University of Southern California, and she's here to talk about a survey that they conducted with college students to uncover the lasting impacts of providing Holocaust education to high school students. This is relevant for all of us in Massachusetts, since a Genocide Education Act is pending in our legislature right now. It was passed by the Senate in July, and it was handed over to the House Ways and Means Committee, where it's under consideration right now. So this survey also comes at a time when, sadly, incidents of anti-Semitism are rising around the world. And other surveys have also shown that, sadly, knowledge about the Holocaust has been diminishing, especially among younger generations. So Claudia is here to talk to us about that survey. And she is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Showa Foundation. She's responsible for facilitating and producing relevant, impactful, and groundbreaking cross-disciplinary research, as well as measuring their program's impact. So Claudia, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit the morning show to talk about this important subject.
Oh, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Well, I was hoping, first off, Claudia, that you could tell us something about the USC Showa Foundation, when it was founded, and what's its mission?
The Showa Foundation was founded in 1994 at the conclusion of Schindler's List, when its director, Steven Spielberg, realized that these stories of survivors were not being collected. And he knew that while making the film, many survivors contributed and helped him to understand the story he was telling in the film. When it concluded, he then embarked on the collection of these important stories. And over the next 25 years later, we have 55,000 interviews with survivors of the Holocaust and other genocides. And we use that very deep archive of audiovisual testimonies to educate, to conduct research, and to do public outreach so that we can keep telling the story of the Holocaust and the impact of it on survivors and others.
Such an important database, and I'm glad to hear that it's as extensive as it is. And I wonder next if you could tell us something about the Echoes and Reflections program that you sponsor, how it's connected to Showa, and I know you have some collaborators in these endeavors as well. So could you tell us about those things?
Yeah, so Echoes and Reflections is a Holocaust education program for U.S. Students in middle school and high school. It is a partnership between ADL, USC Showa Foundation, and Yad Vashem. Together, we bring our expertise in our areas to create this incredible curriculum that provides educators with multimedia resources that they can use however they need, whenever they need it. When I say multimedia, I mean you get artwork, you get testimonies, clips of testimonies, you get the history that's been vetted, and you get all of the resources really that you need to teach this important history.
What an important gift for educators across America. I'm so glad you're doing that work. The next thing that I wanted to ask you about was, Claudia, how did you personally become involved in and engage with the work of the Showa Foundation?
Yeah, that's an interesting, fun question. You know, I was at a transition in my professional life. Before this, 7 years ago, I was a tenured professor at a local university and was looking to make a change. And when I found the mission of the Showa Foundation, and with particular focus on narratives and story as their main sort of way that they change the world, it spoke to me. I'd always worked with narrative, and I am an applied linguist, educator, and that's where my doctorate is in. So it all made sense to me. And when I joined, I was able to bring my background to further extend the work that we do in education.
No, it sounds like a serendipitous pairing then of
Indeed.
your background.
Yes, yes.
With a program and an archival endeavor that relies so much upon narratives. So
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Claudia, I wanted to talk to you about the survey results on the impacts of Holocaust education downstream, so to speak. But before we do that, I hope that you could fill us in on two factors that I believe were part of what prompted the survey. First, what is the state of knowledge of the reality of the Holocaust among young people today?
Yeah, well, there have been a number of survey results that have come out through the Claims Conference, for example. And I think the Pew Research group put other data out about the level of knowledge among young people and adults. And I don't have the specifics of those, but they report a level of knowledge that isn't where we expect it to be, given that this history is included in curricula, and it's in the society. It is part of what we talk about, yet some students and adults alike report that they don't know basic information about this history. With our survey, we looked not only at necessarily at the knowledge of the Holocaust, but looked at how it has lasting impact on individuals who have had Holocaust education. So I think there's work to be done about where students have access to Holocaust, how they have access to Holocaust education. So I think we need to think about that, but we also should think about what we're looking for as a result of providing this education to students, right? So part of it is, what do we teach students about the history? What do we want them to leave with as a result of this history? And there's so much to be learned, including more general lessons from this history that could help students, improve their own lives and address any issues that they have in their lives.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a significant part of worldwide history. That to have it disappear, or some of what I've read suggests they have somehow come away with ideas that minimize the impact and the number of people that were impacted by the Holocaust. So it seems like so important to fill that in and make sure people have an accurate history of what happened, why it happened.
Right.
And Claudia, I think the other factor that is important to acknowledge is that there has been, I believe, a rise in the severity and the extent of anti-Semitic incidents, not just in the United States, but worldwide in the past couple of years. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, there has been a very clear rise in anti-Semitic incidences. So just looking at ADL's ongoing tracking of these incidents, we know that there was a 12% increase from just over a year ago of these incidences. And that's one way to look at it. But these incidences also could manifest in different ways. So 56% of that increase from last year, or from 2018 to 2019, 56% of that increase was in the category of anti-Semitic assault.
Wow.
So that's very troubling because
Yes.
you're seeing more violence associated with this hate. And so it continues to go up. And so we have to keep an eye on that. And one way to intervene in this process is to provide education, right? To in the work that we do at the Showa Foundation, to humanize the experience of being a Jewish person, and also just humanize and give voice to survivors who can help us to develop that understanding, right? And to counter that hate that we're seeing from, perpetrators, in this case, around anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Well, I know that those two factors are part of what across the country is motivating many states to intervene and to have mandates. A lot of schools do, as they do in Massachusetts, already teach about the Holocaust. But the idea of having a mandate means that it would be an expected and required part of curricula across the country. And given those two trends, it seems more and more important to make sure that that education and that humanizing, I like the way you put that, is imported to young people's minds. So given that background, then what was the purpose of the survey that you sponsored?
Well, I think the mandate is an important mechanism to get this education accessible to students. I did want to mention that from 2018 to 2019, ADL also reported a 19% increase in anti-Semitic incidences in K-12 non-Jewish schools. And again, it's urgent. So we wanted to look at how students in college what they could tell us about the lasting effects of their Holocaust education that they may have had in their previous education, like in high school, for example. So we wanted to know what might their attitudes be at this point in their life as a result of that Holocaust education. This was a survey where they responded to questions we posed. And these questions were designed using all of the best practices in social science research to obtain information that we could say, tells us something about their attitudes and future behaviors and current behaviors. So we surveyed 1,500 undergraduate students, and we created this group of students or respondents by working with YouGov, which is a national polling company that does this work. This is what they do. And so in working with them, we were able to construct a panel, as we say, to then respond to our survey. And so these respondents were 55% white, about 20% Hispanic, about 13% African American, and 8% Asian. There were other respondents, but these are the more numerically speaking, those that responded. Of this number, about 40% reported being atheist, agnostic, or had no religious affiliation in particular. The other groups were 25% were Protestant, 23% were Catholic, and about 3% was Jewish religion in their reporting. Those are important details to provide so that you can contextualize the responses. It really helps to understand who is responding here. And so I wanted to make sure we understood that. So there were 4 key findings that for us mean the respondents provided their views on these questions in ways that were significant, that when we looked at the data and looked at what they said, we are confident that what they are saying is due to what their Holocaust education may have how it may have influenced them. and that it wasn't just sort of something else. It was due to what they say it was related. So students with Holocaust education report having greater knowledge about the Holocaust than their peers. And they understand the value of Holocaust education, right? So the data showed that they recognize the dangers of anti-Semitism, right? So 27% more likely than those who didn't have any Holocaust education reported understanding how important it was to recognize anti-Semitism. Those with Holocaust education were 20% more likely to recognize and stand up for others who were being discriminated against. So we posed questions and scenarios, and they responded, right, in various ways. But those students with Holocaust education were more likely to demonstrate these behaviors that were positive. And then those with Holocaust education were also 21% more likely to say that they would stop something similar from happening again, like the Holocaust, right? Or the processes that led to the Holocaust. So this is significant.
Yes, I'll say.
Yeah. And then I think also really key, particularly, well, always, but in this time, students were also, who responded having had Holocaust education, were also, it showed that they had more pluralistic attitudes and were more open to differing viewpoints, right? So they had this wider lens within which to view the different people around them or situations around them. So these students were more likely to challenge incorrect or biased information. That's really key when we have conversations right now about information and propaganda and fake news and all of this.
Right.
They were more likely to challenge intolerant behavior and to say something. And that is also really key. A third finding was that, and it's similar to what I just said, was that when presented with a bullying scenario, right? We gave them a scenario of bullying among friends and people and their peers. Students with Holocaust education reported being more likely to offer help, right, to that person being bullied. I can't say how important that finding really was, because this is the kind of what we say is sort of this self-efficacy and the sense of self to be able to bring about change in real time like that is really important, right? And again, it's associated back to what they learned in Holocaust education in high school. This is what they're responding to, right? And it's quite powerful. A fourth finding that is also not surprising was that students who had Holocaust education and who learned that education through the use of Holocaust survivor testimony, right? Watching clips of testimony online, but also in person, that this led to even greater outcomes in what we saw in the data. And we're not surprised, because it is a human being telling a story and you're connecting to that student. But when we looked at the data, they were much more likely, significantly likely to demonstrate higher critical thinking skills, comfort with differences, the sense of social responsibility, tolerance in groups of others, that there was the sense of civic efficacy, right? The sense that I have a role to play and I see it. And generally this pluralistic orientation about the world.
Claudia, those are extraordinary, extraordinary findings, and they're very encouraging. that an educational program on something that has had such a profound historic impact can have such a profound outcome. And this is years after their experience in high school. Because not only are they more knowledgeable, there's a crossover effect of what they've learned, how they're likely to behave. They become more compassionate. And not only that, but they become more likely to act upon their understanding and their compassion, which means that you have a more robust civic community that is strong enough to understand what the warning signs are of what leads up to genocides. And also, hopefully, we hope to be able to prevent early enough on a movement that might otherwise lead to something catastrophic from taking hold in a community or a culture or a nation. That's just extraordinary. I'm so glad you did that survey, because this is tangible evidence of what the extraordinary impacts are and how important they are to the fabric of our culture, of our civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And you know, you said that you weren't surprised to find out that the most impactful teaching modality was the survivor testimonies, and I'm not surprised at that either, because I had the opportunity to witness survivor testimony here in Newburyport. There's a local filmmaker, author, director, playwright named Anna Smolowitz here. And she also works as a chaplain at a retirement and assisted care community called Brooksby Village in Peabody, Massachusetts. And she made a film about Holocaust survivors who were also residents at Brooksby Village, where she worked as a chaplain.
I see.
And the film was called Out of Darkness, and I attended a screening of that a couple of years ago. You know, she had invited several of the survivors from Brooksby Village there, and all of them, of course, were children, you know, when they had their Holocaust experiences, and they were elderly now, of course. But after watching their interviews during the film then, and hearing about the absolutely harrowing experiences that they had, the lights came up, and there they were. These people who were carriers of history. Oh, it was so powerful. You know, they'd survived. They'd come to America. They'd had careers. They had children. They had families. And they also, though, carried memories that they were sharing with us about some of the worst that a human being could experience. And, you know, honestly, Claudia, I find it hard to put into words the impact that it had on me. But the simplest way to put it is that it made history real. These were real human beings who had been through this and harmed by it. And they were here in the room with me, and it felt like an honor, I have to say, to be in the room with them. And I felt like I owed them to be carefully observant and respectful. And I felt like I owed them something else that's hard to put into words. But I was witness to their stories, and somehow their survival seemed sacred to me. And I tell you that I think about it regularly. I think I'll carry it with me forever. And I'm sure that's partly why I wanted to interview you and help spread the word about the impact of Holocaust education, because I've had this experience myself. And so I'm not surprised to hear that your survey showed that the powerful impact that I experienced is also one that stays with these students and proves to be among the most impactful kind of teaching modality that can be brought to bear on students. So of course that raises some questions though, Claudia, because survivors are aging steadily, of course, and we're losing more of them every year. So I wonder, do you have an estimate of how many survivors are still living in the US or elsewhere?
Yeah, we have about 500,000 survivors that are still alive. About a quarter lives in the US. About 40% live in Israel. And about 15% live in the former Soviet Union.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, I was hoping that you mentioned the work that Showa does earlier with archives and testimony. So tell us a little bit more about what work you do to locate survivors and to obtain their stories, their narratives, and to ensure then that these narratives will be available to younger generations.
Our mission is to develop empathy, understanding, and respect through testimony. And so using that deep archive of survivor testimony that we've collected, we will ensure that young people and anyone willing to watch, that they'll be able to hear these stories long into the future. Yeah. Because we are using powerful technology to ensure that these stories are available in perpetuity at USC Showa Foundation. And are making them available via various kinds of technologies so that students can click and watch. And so we have an educational website, iWitness, IWITNESS, where we make available educational resources for students and teachers around the world who currently access it in 90 countries, where they can watch testimony and learn across the curriculum with this material. So it is sad to see that we will soon no longer have any survivors, but we are working very hard and in partnership to be able to bring this material long into the future and in ways we can't even imagine yet. So we continue to do that. And so over the last 25 years, we've collected, as I said, 55,000 interviews. We've more recently integrated into the archive other collections that we've collected, but that also other partners have collected and we've brought into the archive. So we have about 90 Rwandan genocide survivor testimonies. We have some from the Nanjing massacre in China from the 1930s. We have about 30 of those that are available. We have survivors and other witnesses from the Armenian genocide, the Guatemalan genocide, the Cambodian genocide, from contemporary anti-Semitism, and from the Central African Republic conflict since 2012 to the present. And we have about 4 of those, and the Sudan Civil War, and then the anti-Rohingya mass violence collection that we brought in of about 11. So we're right there on the front lines to continue to add. And this is in response to our, it's part of what the mission that we work on to bring, to realize every day. And that means bringing these voices to fully understand the mechanism, right? And manifestations of genocide, how we get to these moments where you get to this level of violence, and right? And when we know what it looks like over the course of a genocide and across genocides, we can really understand and help students understand them as well, so that they can see what role they play in stopping this cycle of genocide. At the Showa Foundation, as I said, we continue to develop the work to educate and conduct research. On our education side, we literally this week launched our Dimensions and Testimony interactive biographies, is how we call them, in iWitness. These are interviews with survivors where you can ask a question and they return a response. And we recorded them using special technologies so that you can press on your screen and you can ask a question of the student or of the survivor that we recorded. And they can get all the information about that survivor's history.
That's just brilliant. How extraordinary. What an opportunity for the students to be able to do that.
Yes, yes. And so we've done that, and then in partnership with Hold On to Your Music, which is an organization that brings the story of Lisa Yura through Mona Golombek, her daughter, using music and to bring this to students around the world as well. Through that work, we'll be able to develop resources for students in primary education.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So reaching people at even a younger age.
Yes, which is really important.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, that just sounds like such an amazing international resource to bring to bear, Claudia. I'm curious to find out, though, because the work that you do then brings you into constant touch with these harsh realities. You're hearing these stories all the time. And I'm wondering, what impact has it had on you to work with Shoah, and how do you cope with the emotions? Because they can be very challenging. And what makes you stay with it?
You know, I don't watch testimony and in segments where we're listening to this type of the hard stuff, let's say. We don't curate material for young people that elicits strong emotion necessarily. That's not good practice. And we want to always drive our content based on learning outcomes that are aligned to state standards, right? So therefore, when I was really more deeply in the work of watching testimony to create our content, I didn't encounter that so much as finding moments where I realize how more similar we are than different. Even when I'm watching and learning from someone decades older than me and seemingly looking very different. And in an instant, realizing, yeah, no, there's much more similarities here. So I remember hearing Helena Horowitz, which was the very first testimony I watched 7.5 years ago. And she talked about hiding her Jewish identity in Poland so that she wouldn't literally be killed. And that prompted me to reflect on my own experience hiding as an undocumented student in 1970s Los Angeles. Now, how does that happen? And I hadn't really even thought about that experience personally. It was just something you move on, right? And so that was really powerful. And then I have my favorite, testimonies because they really, they resonate in very personal ways. So you have Elena Nightingale talk about being in this bicultural experience as a refugee from Italy after or during the Holocaust, and arriving here in the US and then not really being part of one culture or the other. I knew something about that, being an immigrant from Mexico. And then Gerard Zorthian, who's from our Armenian collection, an even older gentleman at the time of the interview, and talking about a Sunday afternoon out on a picnic with his family. And he describes it so beautifully that I think it made me cry the first time. And I immediately could remember those moments in my own childhood. So what happens is you immediately connect, and you're humanizing now these people who, when I think a young person then leaves the experience, they're going to remember. And remember that there's more in common with that person you think is different from you than you think.
What a powerful lesson, and thank you for those vivid examples of connecting across time and space and history.
Indeed.
And hearing you describe those, Claudia, it's perhaps not surprising that the Holocaust education has the powerful impacts and the positive impacts that you were describing earlier, because we're all human. We all recognize feelings We all recognize similar kinds of experiences. They may be different on the outside, but on the inside, they have a similar kind of impact.
Indeed.
So thank you for that. That's very thought-provoking. I have one final question for you before I let you go. And that is, you know, as individuals, very often, it's easy to feel that the forces that are brought to bear that create the circumstances in which genocides can unfold are just bigger than an individual or a community, past or present, that they're just so much larger than we are. So short of working for a foundation like Showa, as you do, what are your thoughts or suggestions about the difference that we as individuals really can make?
Okay, so a couple of things. I think, and I'll keep saying it, and I'll keep saying it forever, is humanizing each other. When in that very moment where you encounter conflict, or about to, you're in that space, it's remembering that other person is just like you. It's being curious to ask more questions before making that next comment. Just ask questions, listen. And some of the survivors will tell you that, and you learn from them. You just have to listen. That's what we do when we're watching testimony too. But it's not a passive experience where you're always thinking about your own experience. And that's what we do when we meet people. So it's just being curious and stop before you act. Just think. You know, I think for parents out there who connect with their children's, let's say, teachers, it's helping the teachers seek out resources where that can happen, like testimony, where students can see the human side of history, or an event, or something else similar, right? It's finding those resources. And then also in the context of the Holocaust, it's seeing this event, this watershed moment, and this very specific history that is a history in its own, that we should help students learn from it, to give them the opportunity to learn about it, and also to reflect on it. And in particular, students who may be hurting, who are struggling, who know what discrimination is or have experienced hate or difficult personal circumstances, this history could really help to see their experience in a larger frame of reference, let's say. Because when I see a survivor who talks about being discriminated against, as a student, this is what we're finding in our other data as well, is they get to see their own experience in a larger context, and it says to them, oh, I can get over this. I can overcome this. I can push ahead. And so you have that sense of grit that you want to develop in students. And I think survivor testimony can do that. So how do we make it accessible to young people? Right. So those are some thoughts on your question. There's so much to talk about, my goodness. But I urge you that if your audience has any questions, to contact us, and we'll be glad to speak to them and support.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Claudia, for this wise and extraordinary interview. And also, thank you so much for the work that you do, creating a more humane and humanitarian world, and helping people, I guess I'd put it this way, bring up the best of what they possibly can be, and attain a kind of a wisdom and a compassion. Thank you so much for taking the time to visit us and share your knowledge and your wisdom. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you.
Well, as Claudia Wiedeman and I were discussing in the earlier part of the show, there's legislation pending right now here in Massachusetts to mandate genocide education. So it's now my pleasure and my privilege to welcome Senator Michael Rodrigues to the show. He represents First Bristol and Plymouth in the Massachusetts Senate, and he's going to talk to us about the act concerning genocide education that he is primary sponsor of here in Massachusetts and introduced to the legislature. So Senator, welcome. Thank you so much for visiting the morning show.
Oh, Mary, thank you so much for having me on. This is my pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. I really appreciate it. You know, we've been learning from Claudia of the Showa Foundation about the many positive downstream impacts, as they call them, of Holocaust and genocide education on students, impacts which linger, fortunately, well into young adulthood. And they range from gauge in historical knowledge to changing attitudes about tolerance and diversity to increasing the likelihood of what they call upstander behavior instead of bystander behavior when people witness incidents of hate or bigotry. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Senator, was what was it that prompted you to sponsor this legislation here in Massachusetts, and why did you decide to present it to the legislature at this moment in time?
My background, I am of Portuguese descent, and there's a long Judo-Portuguese history dating way back to the Inquisition and before. And I have been personally involved with the restoration of the oldest post-Inquisition synagogue in Portugal. And then my interest in hobby has grown beyond that into the 20th century. There's a Portuguese hero by the name of Aristides Sousa de Mendes, who was the Portuguese consul to Bordeaux during World War II, where he was personally responsible for saving over 20,000 lives by signing visas against the wishes and the orders of the Prime Minister of Portugal at the time. It's a long history. It's a long answer to the fact is I got interested in the Holocaust, and it expanded to all genocide. Dr. Ron Weisberger, who runs the Holocaust Center at Bristol Community College, has become involved and has influenced me a great deal. And then about 2 years ago, there was 59 graves at a Hebrew cemetery in Fall River were desecrated. And the community all rallied around that. And then I read an article in the New York Times where, 66% of millennials have never even heard of Auschwitz, do not know what Auschwitz is. And it just blew my mind. I know I'm old now, and, to me, it was all part of my life growing up. Yeah. But I realize that if we don't begin to provide basic education of the Holocaust and other genocides in our school system, that it could be dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Claudia and I were talking about the research on the uptick in anti-Semitic incidents, and also how there's been a real diminishment in knowledge of the extent and the severity of the Holocaust. And it is disturbing, given that we all want to honor, never forget. And so we have to work to make sure that none of us forget.
And we need to do it in a way, so what we do is we allow Hollywood to teach us the history of the Holocaust. That's not right. Yeah. It should be instilled upon us at a young age in school, right? Yeah.
Well, Senator, tell us what the mandate here in Massachusetts will include and to whom it will apply.
Certainly. So the bill has been amended. It was originally filed as a mandate, but during the reality of this pandemic, we cannot mandate any additional responsibilities to our school systems. They have all they can do to handle what they got.
Yeah.
So we amended the bill to take a very important first step in creating a genocide education trust fund, whether it's publicly funded, so we have the ability, if we see it so fit, to fund it with public dollars, like we do with the Civics Education Trust Fund. Mm-hmm. And it also allows for private, personal contributions, so we can go to individuals or foundations to invest in this education, so that schools can begin, without being mandated, but to begin to choose to educate their students on genocide. Someday I think this will morph into a curriculum mandate. But like I said, during this pandemic, our schools have all they can handle.
Yeah, you know, they sure have. I have so much admiration for the resiliency of the students, the parents, and the teachers who've just been rallying under really extreme circumstances. So what you just described makes perfect sense to me. It sounds like a great way to make something feasible, doable, and adapt it later on when circumstances are different, which we hope will be as soon as possible. So this has been the longest year in recorded history. So, you know, it's just beyond my ken. So I believe then that this amended version that you've just been describing was passed unanimously in the Senate in July. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And so now I think it is in the Ways and Means Committee. Tell us where it stands now.
Okay, so the bill currently is in the House Committee on Ways and Means. We are having conversations with our colleagues over in the House. This is a priority bill of myself personally, but also the Senate to see that this gets over the goal line. In all fairness to our friends and colleagues in the House, this pandemic also has caused a lot of stress on the legislative process. So now that our primary responsibility in both House and Senate Ways and Means is the budget, the annual operating budget. It took us 8 months to get that done. It was done very well, by the way, but anyway, it's done. Behind us now, so now we can look forward to getting some of these important bills over the finish line over the ensuing, 3 or 4 weeks that we have left in session. So I feel confident it's going to get done, especially given the fact that we amended it so that it's not a mandate. It's just an enabling act.
Great. Yes. Well, Senator, how do you hope that this bill, as it continues to follow the, always a circuitous path of legislation, as it follows the path and reaches closure at some point, how do you hope yourself that it will impact the lives of different communities of students, teachers, and families in Massachusetts?
I hope it's been very disconcerting over the last couple of years to see the amount of anti-Semitic activity, the amount of racist activity, to hear the volume of hate speech, unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. It's disconcerting, and I'm hoping that by educating, especially our middle and high schoolers, on the Holocaust, what it was, and the impact that it had on so many lives around the world, and really the impact it had on world history, we cannot repeat that again. And it starts with the littlest of things. Hate is, it's like a snowball that once it gets rolling, it grows and grows and grows and grows. And we need to stop it out immediately. And this would just be one step, in my opinion, one step to stop that.
And a really significant step as well, because education, in my opinion, civilizes and humanizes. And of course, the Showa Foundation, as Claudia and I were talking about, focuses in particular on survivor testimony. And that is one of the most powerful tools. And a lot of the work they do is, of course, we have, the generation of Holocaust survivors are just slowly but surely dying out, but they're preserving those stories and making them available in curriculum. And I'm sure that when, when it becomes a mandate or when it evolves, that survivor testimony, I'm sure will be a part of that. It's so significant. It makes it real to people, I think. It humanizes the face of history. So I just am very grateful to you personally for your taking this on and presenting it to the legislature, because I think it's just so important. Just before I came on to interview today, I clicked on my phone and my news feed was talking about the only Anne Frank Memorial in Idaho was just defaced with swastikas. So there is a force that is unleashed and needs to be kind of reined in. And I'm sure that this bill and the attention that you're paying to it will be, it's such an important step in that direction. So thank you so much for the work that you've done.
And thank you for allowing me to come on to talk about it, because this is how the word gets spread.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And on that line, if people want to learn more about the legislation or be supportive of it or help out in some way, is there anything that you would suggest people could or should do?
They can go online to malegislature.gov, and it's Senate Bill number 2845.
2845.
2845 at malegislature.gov. And certainly they can read the text of the bill. They can reach out to my office, Senator Michael Rodrigues, or their individual rep or senators, because it was passed unanimously by the Senate. I anticipate eventually it will get passed unanimously by the House.
Great. Wonderful. Let's hope so. Fingers crossed. Thank you so much for taking the time to visit us and fill us in on this significant legislation. I really appreciate your time. And I also really appreciate the work that you're doing. You know what, Senator, you may have to come back on the morning show and talk about that particular chapter of Portuguese history another time. I'm not familiar with that, but it sounds like it's an amazing story. So
I love anytime I can talk about anything Portuguese, I do.
All right. Consider yourself pre-booked down the road.
and that will morph into food and wine, because it always does.
All right. Fair enough. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
That's all for today's show, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 a.m. on Channel 9 for the morning show. Bye now.